Coming up on today's episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we will continue our conversation on regional railroads. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence. And I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who's rapidly becoming a highly trained broadcast specialist, and I'm blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, just a little programming note. This week, we will be on 3 times. So today, Wednesday, and also Thursday. Thursday will be our monthly book review where we'll be talking about a great book on passenger trains by Cato Institute scholar Randall O'Toole. So stay tuned for that. And of course, on Wednesday, we'll also be back. And this time, I'm going to tell some stories about rail fanning in New Jersey, since you guys really enjoyed my discussion on rail fanning in Boston, Massachusetts. So today, let's get to it. Now, I wanted to talk about regional railroads. In the first episode of this 2-part series, we talked about what a regional railroad was and how the modern day, and I say modern day as in the 1980s on, movement came about. So I hope you'll go back and rewatch that if you have any questions or if you haven't quite seen that yet. Today, I want to talk about some of the regional railroads that have become closely intertwined with Class 1 railroads. Also, before we get going too far, the thumbnail, I want to thank Mike Allen. He took this picture of a very good regional railroad, the Iowa Interstate, which is part of Railroad Development Corporation of Pittsburgh and led by Henry Posner III. If you ever have a chance to meet Henry Posner, he is a great guy. He is happy to talk to just about anybody. And when you talk to him, shut your mouth and listen, because he can tell you more about railroading than you can ever know. And it's an amazing experience. So shout out to Henry and shout out to Mike for making this possible. So first thing we're going to talk about today is the Winona Bridge Railway. Now, in the 1980s, the Burlington Northern was experiencing something of a renaissance. Now, we know Burlington Northern was formed in 1970 with the merger of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, Great Northern, Northern Pacific, and Spokane, Portland, and Seattle. In the early 1980s, it added the St. Louis, San Francisco, better known as the Frisco. The real reason it added the Frisco, partly to get access to traffic that served the Gulf Coast and some of the areas such as Oklahoma and Texas, I should say a bigger footprint in those areas. But really, it was to get the Frisco's management team, which consisted of Dick Grayson, and then eventually someone that we all know a lot, especially as it goes to regional railroads, E. Hunter Harrison. So, Burlington Northern, they're experiencing a resurgence, and one of the things that came from that resurgence was their expediter intermodal service. This was simply what you've seen in a lot of instances, which is TOFC, T-O-F-C, trailer on flat car. And here is an example of the expediter intermodal service, or at least part of it, a couple of LMX B39-8 locomotives that are pulling trailers on flat cars, and this looks like it's somewhere up in Montana, which is sort of the area that we'll be talking about here. I want to point out, though, part of what is so interesting about this photo is, for those of you who are watching on CP5 cam, is that LMX represented another way that BN was working to adjust its labor costs, as was the expediter service as a whole. You see, BN's very own, and there we've got our opener there for you again. BN's expediter service was designed to have only 2 crew members. So you've got your engineer and your brakeman. Now, and maybe conductor, depending on where this went, but the idea then as now was to minimize labor costs. And we know that in a lot of places, labor had meant that could be up to 5 men on a train, with very few of them actually doing anything. So this was revolutionary for BN as a whole, but the industry as well. Nowadays, we're very much used to having 2 men on a freight train pretty much everywhere. And obviously this has led to the laughable idea of states and localities, even in some cases, trying to mandate 2 men, or even in some cases more, depending on whoever is pushing their buttons. But this is something that the railroads and unions worked out over time, which is what we here at the All Board Podcast believe in, because quite frankly, railroads negotiating with their unions, their employees, to determine what the labor levels are required to be is the way it should be done, as opposed to government fiat, which sadly is something that we're seeing. Now, BN got this to work with the expediter service, said your engineer and brakeman or conductor, I believe the source, which is Justy, it's actually the law case related to Winona Bridge, specifies brakeman, but I don't believe it's brakeman, I believe it's conductor. This was offered over 2/3 of the Burlington Northern system. So it was something that was well accepted, the expediter services with the adjusted crew sizes. The United Transportation Union was very supportive almost everywhere except in one part of the company, and that was over the former Northern Pacific, which at the time included the Homestake Pass line, Marias Pass, as well as Stampede Pass. So BN said, I think we have a solution to this. And they went to a company that they controlled called the Winona Bridge Railway. And we'll get you for those of you on the CP5 cam, so you can see a little bit of what the Winona Bridge Railway looks like. And I know you're probably thinking, Phil, that doesn't look like very much. I thought we were talking about a regional railroad here. We are talking about a regional railroad here. The Winona Bridge Railway was designed to be a railroad within a railroad. And the Winona Bridge itself was actually a short bridge between Wisconsin and Minnesota, but it was incorporated with its own railroad. And this is something that we've seen in a lot of cases, whether we're talking about terminal areas like the Washington Terminal Company in Washington, D.C., which for many years, and actually still does own Washington Union Station and the track area that goes to it, or the Sault Ste. Marie Bridge Company, which many of you may have heard of, reporting marks SSAM, so it's like SSAM, which owns a bridge across the river between St. Mary's River, between Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and was for many years part of the Wisconsin Central, is another example of that. A lot of times railroads, especially when there were either important borders to cross or other railroads that would be involved in the construction process, would develop or put together a company that would actually own that piece of track. So in this case, Winona Bridge Railway, which was partly owned by the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and the Green Bay Western, owned this route, and eventually the Burlington Northern, successor to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, bought it out, owned all of it, and they said, hey, you know what? It would only take their work rules only require 2-man crew, which makes sense because this wasn't a significant piece of railroad, and it wasn't someplace where there would be a lot of negotiating taking place as far as the way the work rules were going to be executed. After all, when you're talking about something less than 2 miles, in all likelihood, both of the carriers that are using it are going to utilize the work rules that are prevailing on either side, so this wasn't an issue. BN decided, well, we will give this company operating rights all the way from where it is between the little section between Minnesota and Wisconsin, all the way to Seattle, Washington. And what it's going to do is utilize our equipment, and it will have its own crews to provide expediter service in this lane. Now, as you can probably guess, this did not go over well with the unions, and they fought it in court. And it had a pattern that we're going to talk about in a little bit, and that was the Springfield Terminal Railway, as well as Boston and Maine Central, which are all part of Guilford Transportation Industries. Earlier in the decade, the Springfield Terminal had begun the process of leasing the properties of the Maine Central and the Boston and Maine. So those work rules on the Springfield Terminal, which was a very small railroad in Vermont, would apply over those entire carriers, which stretched all the way roughly from Mattawamkeag, Maine, to Selkirk Yard area. Rotterdam Junction, I believe, is the actual location in New York State. So pretty substantial railroads when put together. But when BN tried it, it didn't do it exactly in the same way. The court held that this was not going to be an effective strategy because what they were doing is not taking something that was truly existing and had operating and so forth, operating rights and so on, and extending them. Whereas in the case of the Springfield terminal, it actually did lease those properties, as in became the operator of them. Another flaw in what BN was doing is that they suggested this would only apply to new work, not existing. And that was put in place because obviously there was a big concern that if we have a labor agreement and the labor agreement says you have to use X number of crew members, well, then if you are suddenly abrogating it simply by letting the Winona Bridge come in, then you'll be effectively abrogating the entire agreement, and that violated the contract rights of the employees. And the court said, yeah, that basically is what you're doing, because then you could claim that almost any traffic that you put on the railroad would be new traffic, especially if, let's say, a shipper were to stop shipping by rail and then to start shipping by rail again. So therefore, this ended the Winona Bridge saga. What you later saw was a substantial portion of this route be spun off to Montana Rail Link. That also included a locomotive maintenance facility, which on its own ended up being the subject of a lot of labor strife before eventually becoming CECO and CEECO and later on shutting down. In addition, a portion of the route, the Stampede Pass route, was sold to the Washington Central and later bought back when BN discovered that it didn't have enough capacity on its northern route, which is a former Great Northern primarily. And so that way they were able to operate trains over Stampede Pass as well as Stevens Pass, where Great Northern and Burlington Northern trains were primarily going. But this showed to be an interesting part of the effort to establish and build on the successful regional railroad model, even if it was not intended to be as much of an individualized, separate company within a company, the way that we saw in other places. Now, the second that we'd like to talk, let me back up. Before we go a little bit further, I want to point out one other thing, going back to the photo we showed you earlier, which I will put back up here for a moment, which is related to LMX. Now, as you can see, one of the big drivers behind the BN's effort to change the arrangement of the way it operated its lines was labor. In fact, that was the primary driving force. In this photo, you see, as I mentioned, the LMX B39-8s, the LMX B39s, as well as the Oakway SD60s. And these were SD60s that were painted in the EMD demonstrator scheme with the nomenclature leased to Oakway Incorporated. Those were operated by the BN with the goal of having outside forces conduct the maintenance. In addition, BN only paid for these locomotives using power by the hour, so you actually had something like a meter to determine how much electricity that these diesel electric locomotives generated, and then they paid the lesser for them based on how much electricity. So just think about it, the same way that you pay for electricity in your home or in your office or in your shop, the BN was doing this on a mobile basis, which I actually think to be quite innovative, not only for the time, but overall, because what would be a better way of determining how should I put it, a strong way of providing remuneration to a lesser for that, but also restricting this to what you're actually using. Because if you think about it, if I'm paying you for the day to have a locomotive, which is how a lot of the current lease agreements are denominated. Now, that doesn't mean that you're actually sending $40, $100, $400, whatever the amount is per day to the lessee, or excuse me, the lesser if you're the lessee. But it does mean that when the locomotive is not operating, when it's sitting in the shop, when it's sitting and waiting for traffic or otherwise, it's not generating you very much at all. So if it's at idle, it's generating electricity simply to sit there than it is when it's going full throttle. So therefore, you're maximizing as much use as you can get out of that locomotive and paying for that use. You're also paying the lesser in a way that compensates them for the wear and tear on the equipment in a very precise way. Because after all, if, for example, I'm using the locomotives to go hard up Marias Pass with a lot of coal and they're really being worked to death, then the lesser is being compensated for the loss of the quality of their equipment as it's being utilized. So I thought that was very innovative and I wanted to point it out, but it is a way that the BN was being very enterprising in its approach to railroading in the 1980s. And a lot of this obviously is an outgrowth of not only bringing Dick Grayson and his team from the Frisco on board, but Darius Gaskins, interestingly enough, who had been a former Interstate Commerce Commission chairman. And I want you to think about that for a second, because if you listen to enough of the All Aboard podcast, you will know that we really lampoon the Interstate Commerce Commission for being one of the biggest brakes on the growth and success of the rail industry, because quite frankly, it was. But Darius Gaskins, coming from that milieu and the public policy side of the equation, that was really telling as to what a lot of the actors would have been able or willing to do had they not been really handcuffed by the way the regulation and the approach had been taken by the board over the decades that it effectively ran the railroad system from Washington, D.C. Now, the next we're going to talk about is the Lake States Transportation Division. And the Lake States Transportation Division is something that isn't really well known because the Lake States was only around for roughly 1 year. And we'll get you a little picture of the Lake States. You see on your right a Soo Line locomotive with Lake States on the front of it. And to the left is a Milwaukee Road locomotive that is pulling, and it's got another Soo Line unit trailing it. Now, why are we talking about Lake States, and what does this have to do with the regional railroad movement? Well, December 19th, 1977, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul and Pacific, better known as the Milwaukee Road, it goes bankrupt. Now, as you've probably learned if you've read Merging Lines, which we did a review of a couple of weeks ago, the Milwaukee Road, which is a carrier that stretched as far east as Louisville, Kentucky, effectively Bedford, Indiana, but actually Louisville, Kentucky, through Chicago, up to Milwaukee, into the Twin Cities, and then across the Dakotas, Montana, Idaho, and Washington State to Seattle and Tacoma, as well as the Olympic Peninsula. So that gives you an idea, a very substantial railroad. For many years, it was understood that although it made a gallant effort to reach the West Coast, and it did generally provide good service, there was not enough traffic to support it. And so as the Burlington Northern was created, when you saw the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern, who were the two primary competitors for the Milwaukee Road in that Pacific Northwest region, merged together with the other carriers to form the Burlington Northern in 1970, that was believed to be the death knell for the Milwaukee, because now it would not really be able to compete with such a strong carrier that, oh, by the way, could bring traffic from as far south as Texas, given the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, which actually was bigger than either the GN or the NP and had a very strong reach, in addition to a lot better access to grain traffic than the Milwaukee itself had when you were talking about its lines through Idaho into Missouri, as well as, did I say Idaho? I mean Iowa, and into Missouri as well as Nebraska. Now, what ended up happening, though, is the Milwaukee Road negotiated access to several what were called gateways on the Burlington Northern to where it could have access to additional traffic, and that sustained it for a while. Unfortunately, 1977, the magic had worn off, the company was bankrupt, and then what was even worse, 3 years later, February 29th, 1980, the Pacific Extension, which was that route to the Pacific Ocean, west of Miles City, Montana, was abandoned. It was shut down. Now, portions of it still exist. I know there is a short line, I believe a portion of it in Montana, a portion in Idaho, and then Tacoma Rail has a fair amount of it in the Seattle and Tacoma area as well. If you have some time, and I encourage each of you to do it, we'll link it in the description. Todd Jones, and I don't know who Todd Jones is, but he wrote a very good description called Milwaukee Road in the 1970s, What Really Happened. It's on TrainWeb. Now, because I don't know who Todd Jones is, I can't really verify his experience and where he got this information from, but a lot of it does seem to check out with what happens with a lot of corporate practices. And basically it says that, you know what, they didn't do a great job of their accounting. In fact, in some cases, may have maliciously charged a lot of extra expense to the Pacific lines, which led to their being abandoned because when Graham Claytor and Stanley E.G. Hillman and so forth got the numbers and didn't really have a way to verify this otherwise, they looked at it and said, well, there's no profit. Why do I think this is true? It's because after that happened, the remaining system, which is everything east of there, including the famous Hiawatha route between Chicago and the Twin Cities via Milwaukee, which, by the way, in some of our Railfan videos, we have shared for you, so please go over and watch those. It was somewhat profitable at times, but it was never profitable enough to come out of bankruptcy and be its own railroad. So, in the 1980s, the Grand Trunk Western, part of Canadian National, the Chicago Northwestern, which by then was independent, it had gone through the 1970s mostly being the employee-owned Chicago and Northwestern. Now it wasn't quite as employee-owned because a lot of the employees didn't have their stock to the extent that they did when it became independent from Northwest Industries. And the Soo Line, which was part of Canadian Pacific and still is, primarily controlled but not 100% owned then, but had for a long time the Soo Line itself, which consisted of the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic, the Minneapolis St. Paul and Sault Ste. Marie, and the original Wisconsin Central. All of those carriers had been controlled to a certain extent by Canadian Pacific. In 1960, the Wisconsin Central and the Minneapolis St. Paul and Sault Ste. Marie, which was originally known as the Soo Line, were merged in the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic to create the current day Soo Line. So that's what it was. They all bid for the Milwaukee, and the Soo Line won. That's why you see this photo that we have here of the Soo Line and the Milwaukee Road. So that's how we got here. Now, you say, all right, Phil, that was a great history. Why is that germane to what we're talking about with regional railroads? Well, that's because this left a lot of trackage that was available for the under ownership of the Soo Line. So they created what was called the Lake States Transportation Division. As I mentioned, the Milwaukee Road in this area, Illinois, Wisconsin, and into Minnesota, which is a majority of what the Soo Line got, that they were very strong there. They had a lot of routes. So this meant the Soo Line now had duplicate trackage. So everything you see here as Lake States Transportation, all this track, which was most of the original Soo Line Railroad, the post-1960 Soo, that was east of the Twin Cities and Duluth, was put into this separate regional within a carrier. Now, by the time this happened, regional railroads had been understood to be something of a success story, but not on this large of a scale. And this was 2,000 miles. So Soo Line, hives it off. It works well, but they're going to sell it anyway. Now, some reports I've seen say that it was required for them to do it by the Interstate Commerce Commission because, as we know, the Interstate Commerce Commission was focused on maintaining competitiveness. And this is something that even the Surface Transportation Board in today's times will continue to do. When there are railroad mergers, there will often be conditions that allow either, in some cases, shippers to get access from a competing rail carrier. So you can have what is described by some as being more competitive access, or to compensate for what they perceive to be a loss of competitive access. In other cases, you'll have a railroad that is allowed to access certain points, as we mentioned earlier with Milwaukee Road being able to access certain points on the Burlington Northern. Well, the ICC may have ordered this. I haven't seen any evidence to indicate that, although please don't sue me. I will, in fact, go back and look at some of the case logs to see where I can find that order. But others have suggested that what really happened is the Soo Line had spent so much money on purchasing the Milwaukee Road. The price ended up being a lot higher. Not only was it about 140 million thereabouts in cash, which was substantial now and was substantial in the 1980s when this happened, but also it meant the assumption of some of the Milwaukee's liabilities because the Chicago-Milwaukee Corporation, which was what was left of the company primarily in land after the railroad had been sold off, did not take all the liabilities with it and pawned some of it off on the buyer. So it's also believed that part of the reason they did this sale was to help them pay down their debt, which is reasonable. And this, of course, is the core of the Wisconsin Central Limited, the Ed Burkhardt era version of the Wisconsin Central that became such a darling of Wall Street and was so unprecedented in the rail industry because it had been decades, and I mean decades and nearly a century, since railroads had enjoyed that level of stock price growth, because Wisconsin Central, not only was it backed by private equity, Berkshire Partners and Greenbrier Equity Group, Greenbrier and Berkshire, of course, who would later go on to purchase Electromotive division from General Motors and make it into Electromotive Diesel before selling it off to Caterpillar. They were and still remain two of the premier private equity investors in industrial assets. So their expertise, combined with Ed Burkhardt, who was a strong transportation man off of the Chicago and Northwestern, and then of course you had Tom Power, who had been president of the Milwaukee Road at one point. All of them together took this over and made it into a successful railroad. Now, after that, it ended up going public, and that's where we talk about a lot of the strong stock price growth that happened. However, as time went on, we all know the Wisconsin Central got involved in a variety of international rail expansions, including Transrail in New Zealand, as well as English, Welsh, and Scottish Railways. That was their big, gigantic operation in Britain. And what's so interesting about that is the EWS was actually larger in revenue terms than the Wisconsin Central itself. So had things gone slightly differently, and quite frankly, as people who aren't involved in the boardroom, I want to emphasize that we don't really understand how these things go without having the fly on the wall access to some of these food fights that take place. But had it gone differently, I think you very well may have seen a very large, successful transportation company that is multinational, which outside of shipping companies and some of these, border crossing situations, such as Canadian National and Canadian Pacific, you really don't have much of true worldwide multimodal companies. And I do believe Wisconsin Central was on the verge of doing that, and it's too bad that that didn't take place. However, one way that you can get a little bit of the explanation of what happened there is also linked in the description, and that is Ed Burkhardt's recent interview with Brooks Bentz, where he talks a lot about everything that happened. He doesn't quite go all the way, because you can tell he definitely wants to throw a little bit more, have a little bit more of a food fight, so to speak, but he does give you great insight into what happened and how the company was created and everything that goes into it. So after you get done watching me, I want you to go watch him, because you will learn a lot and you will be much richer for listening to us both. So that is the story of Lake States and how it was ultimately successful in preserving a lot of key routes. What I also want to caution you, though, as we're thinking about Lake States a little bit, notice what happened, though. And we alluded to this in the last episode. Lake States was property that was part of Canadian Pacific. Much of that property is now part of Canadian National, although in the last 2 years, a substantial chunk of this was sold off to Watco, and it is part of 3 different railroads: the Wisconsin and Southern, Grand Elk, and the Fox Valley and Lake Superior. So a lot of the operation that they had beyond just what CN needed as part of its Chicago to Duluth main line. So this is what a lot of the fears are when it comes to selling off track is, well, if it becomes successful, what happens if someone else gets it? So as I said, if you are a prospective railroad owner or somebody who thinks, I really want to invest in this, it's up to you to give that selling carrier the confidence by proposing agreements and otherwise that say, this is how we're going to make sure it doesn't get in the hands of your competitor, and you have the opportunity to keep this in your family. So I think that's noteworthy, because there are a lot of people who will entertain ideas of, well, what if we did this with the railroad? What if we did that with the railroad? And it doesn't go anywhere. Well, that's a big reason why it doesn't go anywhere, because of that fear, and those prospective purchasers don't do enough to make sure those fears are appropriately allayed. Now, we move on to another regional carrier, which is probably the most controversial of all, and that's surprising, because we're talking about controversy and what happened with Winona Bridge. You'd think we kind of cornered the market on it, but this last big one we want to discuss, at first isn't going to look so big. And I know, Phil, you got a 44-tonner in a tank car. crossing a little bridge in New Hampshire. I know. That is the Springfield Terminal Railway. The Springfield Terminal Railway we mentioned a little while ago, it was a subsidiary of the Boston and Maine. Now, we've heard a lot about the Boston and Maine. This is one of the preeminent carriers in New England. So Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, New York State, very substantial operation there. However, by the time you'd gotten into the 1950s and the 1960s, it had very much fallen on hard times. Part of that is due to the deindustrialization that took place in New England, but a lot of it also had to do with how poorly some of these carriers were run. And again, going back to merging lines, one of the things that Richard Saunders Jr., the author of that book, mentions is that at one point it took 80 hours, 80 hours to move traffic from Boston to the Rotterdam Junction Selkirk Yard Gateway. I want you to think about that. You can probably drive across the state of Massachusetts, or Commonwealth of Massachusetts, as it's correctly known, in about 2 hours on the Massachusetts Turnpike. That means that trucks can do the same thing. And on the Massachusetts Turnpike, you're allowed to have turnpike doubles, which are, in this case, two 53-foot-long trailers. Now, at the time, that wasn't allowed, the 53-foot-long trailer, but that does show you where a truck would be so much more competitive in this portion of the haul. And now let's consider, it's not likely that most of the traffic was simply going from the Boston or Portland area just to the gateway in Rotterdam Junction. But if it takes 80 hours, and that is more than, that's almost 4 days long, little less than 4 days long for the traffic to get through a small portion of that. Well, how long is it going to take to get beyond that when you consider the time needed to classify it at a connecting carrier, which in this case would be Penn Central, previously the New York Central, or if it was going down the Delaware and Hudson to the Erie Lackawanna, how long would that take? And then for it to move beyond there. So that meant for higher value traffic and traffic that absolutely had to be there within a certain amount of time, this made the railroad unviable. And when you consider that New England, as I said, the deindustrialization was becoming much more of an area where consumer goods would simply be brought into, that meant the railroad at all was not viable. And so that made them bankrupt in 1970. It was supposed to join Derico. And we remember that Derico was the vehicle by which the Norfolk and Western and Chesapeake and Ohio were going to take control of a lot of let me make sure I don't want to say second rate because my favorite railroad, the Erie Lackawanna, is one of them, but I could say secondary carriers. The Jersey Central, the Reading, the Erie Lackawanna, the Boston and Maine, as well as the Baltimore and Ohio, which already was part of this network with the Chesapeake and Ohio controlling it then. This was supposed to be the way the Interstate Commerce Commission, Delaware and Hudson as well, was going to be able to protect these carriers from potential loss of traffic due to single line routings, because traffic that may otherwise have been interchanged to them, even if it was moving for a relatively short distance of time or distance and period of time, was still accretive to their bottom lines. The Derico arrangement was supposed to allow them to come within the umbrella of the merged N&W and C&O, which was supposed to be named Norfolk and Western, but by protecting that carrier, newly merged carrier, from the enormous indebtedness that almost every one of these carriers had, and also basically saying, look, if you can't succeed under this arrangement and you go bankrupt, then it's going to be your problem, and it's not going to come back on us as the parent company. Well, the B&M decided we want to stay out of Derico. That was one way, part of what contributed to their bankruptcy. They never joined Conrail, and so there was some talk that they would possibly be part of it. But in 1981, they were sold to Timothy Mellon, who is a scion of the Mellon family, Mellon and Scaife families there. So in 1981, it became part of his company, Guilford Transportation Industries, which had started by operating a tie treatment plant in Boston. Now, why is this significant? Before I go further, the name Guilford comes from his estate in Connecticut. A lot of people always wondered where that was because the name Guilford was never really part of the B&M or Maine Central, which is the other main railroad as part of that lexicon. But that's where the name comes from. The next carrier to come in was the Maine Central. That was also purchased by Guilford in 1981, a little bit before the Boston and Maine. Now, it had an interesting story. It had a very strong CEO for many years, E. Spencer Miller, and he was really the dean of New England railroading. And one of the things that he wanted to do as his time leading the railroad was coming to an end was to give the carrier a home. So he negotiated a deal with the U.S. Filter Corporation, Filter, and that's right, it doesn't have anything to do with railroading, that would have for U.S. Filter to purchase the Maine Central, which it did. But U.S. Filter itself was shortly thereafter sold, and the new owners looked over and said, we're glad to own the U.S. Filter Corporation, but why do we own a railroad? I mean, we didn't come here for that. So, of course, they said, all right, we're putting it on the block. We're going to sell that. And so that is how Timothy Mellon ended up controlling the Maine Central as well. Now, as I mentioned, under the Boston and Maine, and let me just give you a little picture. This is what Guilford Transportation Industries looked like toward the end. Those red segments, I believe, are indicating sections of the railroad that are eligible for or been upgraded for 285,000 mile, I'm sorry, 285,000 pound traffic movement. So that was one of the big things of the last decade. So now we're actually moving up to the ability to carry cars of 315,000 pounds because, of course, what really helps railroading become more successful is the ability to move fewer cars with heavier loads. So, the Springfield Terminal, being that small railroad we mentioned earlier with the 44-tonner that looked like it comes straight off the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, it leased first the Maine Central and later the Boston and Maine, and that lease meant the Springfield Terminal actually became the operator legally of these properties. That allowed the Springfield Terminal's work rules, which only required 2 men on the train, to become the norm over the entire property. Now, labor didn't like this, but they couldn't really do much about it because it was ruled to be legal. It did not work when they tried the same thing with the Delaware and Hudson, which had been sold by the N&W after the merger with the C&O did not take place, and the Delaware and Hudson was the last remaining portion of the Derico system, which of course only ended up consisting of the Delaware and Hudson, and the Erie Lackawanna. Sold the Delaware and Hudson to Guilford Transportation Industries. And so when they tried to expand the Springfield Terminal arrangement over the rest of the system, which would have taken it all the way now down to Sunbury, Pennsylvania, through Binghamton, New York, the unions went crazy. There was actual violence. And so Timothy Mellon and Guilford responded by simply putting the Delaware and Hudson in bankruptcy and walking away. That led to its operation by the New York Susquehanna Western Railway, which was funded by CSX, because CSX believed if they put money into this and they were able to prop it up and get it to run well, that they, through the NYS&W, would be able to take control of the D&H and get access to the Northeastern market, which they had previously. By the way, I want to point that out. Through the B&O, since the B&O had controlled Baltimore and Ohio, controlled the Reading, the Chesapeake and Ohio controlled the Baltimore and Ohio, and then the Reading controlled the Jersey Central, they had access into the Northeast, which at one time took them right up to Jersey City and the New York waterfront. However, as the reorganization of the Reading and the Jersey Central went along, even though the Baltimore and Ohio was a significant participant in this, they decided to cut those railroads loose, and they were, of course, swept into Conrail. Now, that did not end their access because they did retain operating rights to get back to the areas where the B&O and ultimately CSX, through the ownership arrangement, actually had access to. So they still did operate there, although they did it very sparingly. They had a couple of trackage rights trains, and if you look through rrpicturearchives.net, you can see some pictures of them. Very small, not much happened. And I should also mention, at one point, the B&O controlled the Staten Island Rapid Transit. So the SIRT, where you can ride subway cars today, was originally a railroad controlled by the Baltimore and Ohio, and that was as recent as the 1960s. So, late 1950s into the 1960s. So, CSX, though, they didn't want to spend the money, and rightfully so, to try to rehabilitate and do what it was going to take to deal with the Reading and with the Jersey Central, which quite frankly were pretty far gone due to their excessive indebtedness, and also the fact that they had substantial commuter rail operations, which, as we mentioned over and over again, as much as we love those trains, they didn't make very much money in the latter years. So by the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, they were very much a drain. And when you consider the Baltimore and Ohio itself was always a financially wobbly property, that would have been a very difficult pill for it, and also the Chesapeake and Ohio, which supported it financially and owned the majority of the Baltimore and Ohio after the 1960s, to bear. And I want to stop there for a second, because I know there are going to be a lot of people out there who say, well, Chesapeake and Ohio is very profitable. Why couldn't they have just spent a few of their dollars on commuter service? Maybe they didn't have to send as much back to shareholders. Just remember, even a railroad like the highly profitable C&O had a very difficult time, again, obtaining the capital that was needed to keep their railroad in operation, because something that's returning you 2, 3, 4, 5% is not an investment that most people want to make. And that goes to the same for a lot of members of this audience. We might love the idea of owning railroad securities, but if we're not going to earn much on them, why would we? So in a time when institutional investors were much larger, and by the way, institutional investors, that means the people who who invest money for pension funds and university endowments. So, if they're not earning returns, that really does mean grandma and grandpa are going to have less to live on at a time when defined benefit pension programs were much bigger. So that's why it would have been very difficult for the C&O to say, you know what, let's just go ahead and take over the Reading and the Jersey Central, and we're not really going to worry about the commuter problem. We'll just, wait for something to work out. That would have been a very difficult, not only pill for them to swallow, but it could have very well imperiled that railroad's existence too, which gives you an idea of how difficult these problems were. So going back to the 1980s, the D&H, it was available there. The CSX wanted it, and so they tried to get it. They funded the NYS&W to operate it, and that's why you might remember, there were more than 4 B40-8s that the NYS&W had for many years, and these were actually funded by CSX, and after the designated operation ended, were taken back by CSX, and for years you'd see them running around there. Some of them, interestingly enough, were traded into General Electric and then sold to Guilford Pan Am Railways, which ended up sending them back to CSX when a couple of years ago CSX took over Pan Am Railways, the former Guilford Transportation Industries. But long story short, the gambit to do this did not quite work out, and so Guilford Transportation Industries operated for the rest of its life as the Boston and Maine, and the Maine Central being its principal subsidiaries. It would go on to make agreements with Norfolk Southern to create the Patriot Corridor, for one, which is where they actually sold a half interest in their line across Massachusetts to the NS and created Pan Am Southern, which was a subsidiary where they operated trains basically for Norfolk Southern to give the NS an entry into New England, which it did not get through the Conrail transaction, and so they were able to become more competitive with CSX. They also made an agreement with I think it's NERRPA, New England Railroad Passenger Authority, which is what allowed the Downeaster to start operating between Boston and first Portland, and now I believe it's Rockland, Maine. And that on its own was a contentious issue, because I know there were questions about whether the train would be allowed to go the speed that was originally agreed to in the contract. And this was one of the things that generally made Guilford, later known as Pan Am, gave it a negative image as far as a lot of railroading, not just rail enthusiasts, but railroaders overall was concerned. Now, I don't believe that the Guilford Pan Am management was evil, mean, reckless, and malevolent, and those are the stories basically what you're going to hear when you go to a railfan forum or a railroaders forum to talk about the company. I do believe that you had an owner that looked at it and said, well, this is an opportunity to earn a return from assets that, quite frankly, nobody else wants, and that there had to be a more aggressive tack taken in order to do that. The old work rules that the Boston and Maine and the Maine Central had with the larger crews simply did not work. And that's not only because the overall management of the strategy didn't work, but also the execution didn't work. So both management and labor were complicit in the decline of that railroad. And finally, New England railroading overall, it went the way that New England did. If you go to New England now, whether you're talking about Boston or Worcester or Portland or otherwise, it's much more of a tech-centric kind of quote unquote new economy type area. It was not the area that was going to be able to support the heavy railroading that existed as of the 1950s and the 1960s. So there was going to be a decline, whether it was Timothy Mellon or otherwise, who ended up pushing that change through. So eventually, Guilford Transportation Industries was renamed Pan Am Systems, and the company became the operating railroads were known as Pan Am Railways. That is because Mellon eventually purchased the Pan Am name and operated the third incarnation of Pan Am. So the original Pan Am won trips, Pan Am, which we all remember with the building and the Clippers, 747s and so forth. Of course, that went out of business in 1991. Later on, the name was resurrected and it was operated by, I believe, it was Marty Shagru, who had been a bankruptcy trustee, had a little bit of success, took over Carnival Airlines and then failed. That was Pan Am 2. Timothy Mellon had the third, which he operated both on its own and with Boston, Maine Airways, which I do believe at one point an earlier company had an affiliation with the railroad, although correct me if I'm wrong. And so that's how you saw the name and the blue ball logo end up on locomotives and rail cars and locomotives you can still see running around the network, but primarily in New England. And then, of course, a couple of years ago in 2022, CSX closed on its acquisition and now has the majority of the former Boston, Maine, and Maine Central routes that are still in operation. Now, I just wanted to cover briefly a couple of others. This is the New York Susquehanna and Western. We had to show you a picture of a GP18 pulling some E9s, leading some E9s, not pulling them because the E9s we assume are working, an SD45, pulling a stack train through New Jersey. The NYS&W was a small carrier that by the end of its time as an independent railroad was primarily operating in New Jersey from the Jersey City Secaucus area out to the western portion of the state. At one point it had been part of two larger systems, one of which were at least the Wilkes-Barre and Eastern, which took it all the way out to Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and it was also part of the New York and Ontario Midland system, along with the New York and Ontario and Western, NYO&W, which ultimately saw it as being the eastern end of a network that went as far as Oswego, New York, and Lake Ontario. Those days were long over. Of course, we know the NYO&W went bankrupt and was almost entirely dismantled. There may be a small, less than a mile section of the NYO&W at all in existence anywhere. The NYS&W was later controlled by someone who probably was pretty close to being malevolent, named Irving Maidman. Irving Maidman milked the property. It declined for years. I also want to find a way that I could possibly see his rationale, though it didn't work. But it later became part of the Delaware Otsego system that was led by a man named Walter Rich. Walter Rich has a great story because he was a law school student and decided, a law school student loved trains, by the way, and decided that he was going to operate a tourist railroad to help pay for his law school. So if anybody has ever wondered if it's possible to be successful in America, yes, it is. And Walter Rich proved it. He decided to operate a tourist railroad in Cooperstown to pay for his law school, and operated he did. And that became the Cooperstown and Charlotte Valley became the little nugget that from which would grow the Delaware Otsego. Eventually, he did take over the NYS&W, which by then ended at roughly Smoke Rise, New Jersey. If you haven't heard of it, that's because most people haven't either, due to a washout. So what he did is he put the railroad back together, solved the washout, and then ended up operating over a portion of Conrail's former Lehigh and Hudson River, which was known as the Hudson Secondary, and that got it into Campbell Hall, New York. It then obtained operating rights over Conrail as far as Binghamton, so it could connect to the second piece that Walter Rich purchased, which was the Syracuse and Utica branches, which extended from Binghamton to Utica, New York, and Syracuse via Shenango Forks. Now, This is what allowed Walter to be successful and helped to bring about this, which was the stack train era for which the NYS&W became famous. They worked with Sealand, which by that point was part of CSX, in order to give CSX and Sealand access to the New York City market, another way that CSX got back into that market after having left it. And so these trains operated in conjunction with Conrail, which was the owner of a lot of the trackage, as well as Canadian Pacific, who controlled the Delaware and Hudson, allowed the NYS&W to become very successful. And just to give you an idea, even though financially it never went great guns, it was influential enough that in 2004, and this was in his obituary, Walter Rich's obituary in the Wall Street Journal, both George W. Bush, who was the president at the time, and John Kerry, who was challenging George W. Bush, went to meet with Walter Rich, the owner of the Delaware Otsego. And to be clear, Walter Rich was not, the owner of 5, 10 different major companies. He owned primarily the NYS&W and a group of other railroads that had over the years declined. But he was able to parlay that into not only personal prestige, but a lot of prestige for his railroad. And as a rail fan, I really enjoyed it. I actually lived right next to, and my family still does, right a block away from their track in Hackensack. So it was nice to see 257, 258. Those were two of the stack trains come in and go out in the evenings, westbound, mornings eastbound during my summer vacations and winter vacations, watching them make up the trains at CP5 near in Little Ferry, New Jersey, Little Ferry, Ridgefield Park area. You got a real sense of what it took to be an entrepreneur and a successful entrepreneur at that time. And so it really made a big impact on me and certainly made a big impact on the rail industry. Why are we covering that in a situation where we're talking about class ones are involved? Well, first of all, wanted to mention the CSX portion. The second goes back to Walter's influence, and that was seen in the fact that CSX and Norfolk Southern had to buy out Walter Rich and take over Delaware Otsego and leave him in charge of it, by the way, in order for them to get the Conrail deal done, because had they taken over Conrail without doing something to mollify any concerns that he may have had, which primarily would have been, well, there's no real reason for them to work with him anymore because now they own the lines directly that he was competing with, that they were working with him to compete with. So they ended up buying it, and to this day, they have the controlling equity interest in the Delaware Otsego, which includes the NYS&W, although it is independently managed. So I hope you've enjoyed the second portion of our discussion on regional railroads. We will be back talking a little bit more about New Jersey on Wednesday. So please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If there's anything that you don't like, if there's anything that you think we need to change, let me know. If there's anything you really love, like my handsome face, let me know, and we will see you down the main line. And thank you for choosing the All Aboard podcast.